So thanks for coming along tonight, folks. Where both Helen Trinca and Geoffrey Lehmann make welcome returns to the Sydney Institute. I'll introduce them very briefly. The topic, of course, is remembering Elizabeth Harrower, the writer. And so we have Helen Trinca is an associate editor of the Australian and an author. And Geoffrey Lehmann is all sorts of things, but he likes to call himself a poet who's a tax lawyer, which is an unusual title. So we're off with Helen Trinca, then we go to Geoffrey Lehmann, then we go to questions and discussion. Helen, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much also to Anne and Gerard for the opportunity to talk about my new biography, Looking for Elizabeth, and great thanks to Geoff Lehmann for also agreeing to come along and talk about Elizabeth, because he did know Elizabeth personally for a long time as well. So Elizabeth Harrower, when I began telling people the last couple of years that I was writing a biography of Elizabeth Harrower, immediately most people would say, Elizabeth who? Because she isn't particularly well known, although now she will be after the biography, one hopes. But so I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Elizabeth straight up. She was, I think, one of the great, very, very great Australian novelists of 20th century novelists. She was born in 1928. She born in Newcastle, fairly miserable childhood, to be honest, and we'll get onto that later. She wrote 3 fantastic novels in her 20s when she was living in London, and they were published there to critical acclaim, but not much sales. They didn't sell terribly well. She came back to Australia in 1959. She wrote a wonderful book which is really seen as her masterpiece and was published in 1966, and that's called The Watchtower. She was scooped up in that period by people like Patrick White, and she had a great literary circle around her. She basically stopped writing in her 40s, in the 1970s, went into a sort of fairly anonymous life, really living in a fairly, nice but bland sort of flat in Cremorne, and then a miraculous really was rediscovered in 2012, and her books were republished by Text Publishing, and I'll talk about that a bit as well. So then she had another great moment of fame, and her books became better known, and she died in 2020 at the great age of 92. So that's a little potted summary of Elizabeth's life. I wanted to just start a little bit and talk about the sort of person she was, but before I do that, I just wanted to mention the fact that a week or so ago we published a piece in The Australian about the friendship between Elizabeth and Patrick White and the complicated friendship, and I was reminded again of what a household name really Patrick White is in this country, the Nobel Prize winner, and it's very different in a sense, I suppose, from Elizabeth Harrower's name. So he was one of the great people, 20th century writers, obviously, and the story, I suppose, which we'll unpack a little bit later as well, is the extent of how that friendship that he had with Elizabeth, whether that actually contributed to her sort of writer's block at a certain period of time when she wrote less. He was a huge champion of Harrower, and but I'm not going to talk too much about him because obviously this is not about Patrick but about Elizabeth. But it is worth noting, I think, just in a way, that the psychological impact that Patrick White's friendship, which was a really supportive friendship, actually may have had on her difficulties in writing at a certain period of time. So what sort of a person Elizabeth was, I was lucky enough to meet her as well. She was mid-80s, was when she was the books were being republished, so there was publicity around her novels, and I was working, as I am now, at the Australian, and Deb Hope, who was running the review section, said, would I interview this person? Now, to my shame, I had not actually heard of Elizabeth Harrower, and I had not read any of her books, but I obviously recognised the great story this was of a person who had been forgotten about, really, and was rediscovered in her later years. So I tripped off to see Elizabeth, and it was a wonderful interview and a great opportunity to meet her, but that meeting really made me realise I got a very potted sort of sense of what the sort of person she was from that meeting. She was very open in many ways, very conversational, very friendly, but incredibly guarded. And she was a mystery, really, Elizabeth, to many of her friends over the years, even though they knew her as very sociable, and yet she was very secretive about a lot of aspects of her past. And she was certainly a mystery to a reading public and an academic fan base who could never really fathom why she somehow stopped writing, in her 40s. As I said, she'd written by then 5 books and several short stories. Now, 4 of those books were published by 1966. 1957, Down in the City, 1958, The Long Prospect, 1960, The Catherine Wheel, and then 1966, The Watchtower. Then she wrote another book called In Certain Circles, and that was a book that she was, it had a publisher, but she became quite half-hearted about it and thought that it wasn't good enough. And she withdrew it from publication in 1971, and then that is a book that sat in the National Library, or the manuscript sat there for years until it was finally, thankfully, republished in 2014. So we can now see read 5 of her 5 novels, not 4, and a number of her short stories, which had been published in bits and pieces over the years, and they were also gathered together. So we've got a lovely sort of, it's not a big, not a large corpus, I suppose, but it's a terrific one, and we now have everything, effectively everything, mostly everything she wrote is in print. Now, she used to give very different answers about why she'd stopped working. So as journalists, obviously, that was the key element of a lot of the stories in her second coming, so to speak, and why she'd pulled out of publishing In Certain Circles. And it really was, a story about a life and a talent that was sort of unfulfilled, or only partially fulfilled, really. Now, as I said, she was lucky she had that second go at it. In terms of the reasons why she stopped writing, there are many, and Patrick White is one of them. Kylie Tennant is another one, and I'll get to her as well. And Kit Hazard, who is Shirley Hazard's daughter. And they're sort of 3 quite sort of famous names, I suppose, and they contributed in various ways to her sort of writer's block. Let me just correct my thread here. So just getting back to her sort of the period when she was republished, throughout her life she'd been seen herself as a kind of a global writer rather than an Australian writer. She'd read everything. She used to say, I read my way through the Sydney Library, which used to be in the old QV, upstairs in the QVB building, and when she was a late teenager, just after the war and in that period, wartime years, she was a huge reader, and she loved skiting almost the fact that throughout her life that she'd read everything. What she didn't really read in her early days were Australian novels. She also was quite proud of the fact that she was probably about 30 by the time she said that she read Australian work, and of course she loved Patrick White's work, and she read in 1955. She read The Tree of Man when it was published. But she got international attention really very late in the piece, and she was terribly sort of proud of that because she'd lived that quiet life on the lower North Shore for many years. When she had a great circle in those years of Christina Stead, Patrick White and Kylie Tennant. Those people were incredibly important to her, but they, as she got older, of course, and they were older than her, and they died, and she had a life where she found new friends, but they weren't a writing crowd. A lot of people didn't know, I suppose, when she was in her 70s and 80s, that she had been a writer, or if they knew, they didn't really. She wasn't positioned particularly. When the books were republished, of course, it was quite a good literary moment. It was quite a story, and I did feel, meeting Elizabeth that day too, that it was a sense that she, she was extremely, as I said, friendly, tall, upright and grand in many ways, but she was reticent, and she had her books, her personality and her books are similar in one way. And one of the best descriptions, I think, is James Wood, the New Yorker critic who discovered her work in 2012. He said the books had a kind of wounded wisdom, and I think that really sums up Elizabeth. She had hard-won wisdom from a life which had been quite complicated as a child. She'd been a child of divorced parents, and she found that very hard at a time in the 30s, really, when people weren't divorced. And she'd been dumped a little bit on relatives and a grandmother who'd been difficult. So she found she had not had an easy life psychologically in her early years, and her wisdom, I think, came over the years from her writing. She saw her writing became a lens through which she made sense, really, of the world. So when it came to writing the biography, I was really, a lot of people say, why, what interested you about her? And I think it was that sense of, there was obviously the surface story of why she'd stopped, but also you could see in Elizabeth enormous depth, really, and an ability to look at life and really look below the surface of life. She was by no means a sort of a shallow person at all. Now, the process of biography was interesting this time around because she left a huge number of letters. So she was a prolific letter writer. She'd stopped writing books and she kept writing letters. I think she got to that typewriter of hers every day. God knows how many letters she wrote in the 70s and the 80s when she really was writing a lot. How many she wrote every day is hard to imagine. She had great correspondence with Shirley Hazard, who was living in New York and in Italy. She had correspondence with Christina Stead, and then, of course, Christina came back to Australia, so a bit less, I guess. She had a long correspondence with Judah Watton. He lived in Melbourne, and they'd met in the 60s, and he was a great supporter of hers, so there's a lot of letters there. And basically, and a massive correspondence with Nancy Phelan. And the great joy of Elizabeth's letters, which are mainly in the National Library and some in the Mitchell, are that she was a great typist. So they're actually easy to read compared with Nancy Phelan, who wrote these, you look at some of the letters and there's several pages and it's written in this scrawl that's unreadable. So you get a lot more from Elizabeth's letters than from Nancy's. Now, that was a huge help for the biography, obviously, because you had a lot of information about herself. She doesn't give away huge amounts of what she's feeling, but there's enough there. The sadness of it is that she tore up at the most important letters, probably, which were the letters between that she wrote to her mother and her mother wrote to her. When Elizabeth was in London in the 50s, she's a young woman in her 20s. She's writing her books. She's struggling with, she's not struggling to write really, but she's probably struggling with her personal life. Her mother's in Sydney, and there are lots of letters, but Elizabeth in her 90s basically, or late 80s, tore them up. And there's only a couple of letters that I found anyway from her mother which are useful. Now, I'm going to just skip and say something about the relationship that she had with Kylie Tennant, which was a really interesting one. They were great friends. Kylie was a sort of, I guess, a social realist writer from that period, and she was by the time she meets Elizabeth in the 60s, she's quite an identity in Sydney. She's writing lots of columns and anecdotal pieces in the Sydney Morning Herald, and she's working with the publisher, with Macmillan's. They had a great friendship and bought a house together in the mountains, and that was like a retreat. They'd go up there at the weekends. Not so much was known about that, but you gather quite a lot from the letters. And it was a big love affair in many ways. Now, people say, were they gay? Kylie was married, obviously. She had teenage children, and I don't believe that was a gay relationship, but it was certainly an immensely emotional relationship, probably I think, the biggest emotional relationship that Elizabeth ever had. And it's been quite an interesting process being able to talk about that and talk about, in some ways, that was another, when that began to fall apart in the early 70s, and Elizabeth struggled with it, trying to stay close to Kylie but get more independence. that was also a period when she was really struggling to write. So that one could argue that's another reason for her sort of writer's block. Now, there are other culprits in that. Shirley Hazzard is the famous one. Now, some of you may be aware of the letters between Hazzard and Harrower that were discovered a few years ago, and they've been published as a great book of letters by Susan Wyndham and Birgitta Olivers, and they reveal, in effect, something which we didn't know before, which was that Shirley's mother, Kit Hazzard, lived in Sydney. She had a lot of problems, psychological problems. Somehow or other, Shirley sort of engineered it to some extent so that Elizabeth, living here in Sydney, became almost like a surrogate daughter and did a huge amount of care for Kit. And people like Patrick White felt that Kit and the effort being put into Kit was actually taking Elizabeth away from her writing, that was one of the reasons why she didn't write, is she was too distracted looking after other people. And I think that's certainly a big thread through Elizabeth Harrower's life, is that she was very empathetic and she really wanted to help. She needed to help and be needed, and she spent a lot of time doing that. Now, I've talked a little bit about... I'm deliberately not talking too much about the books because Jeff's going to talk about those in far better than I can, because I think, after all, I am happy to confess that I'm not a literary analyst, I'm a journalist really, and so the emphasis of the book is very much on her life. Now, winding up soon? No? So I just wanted to... talk a little bit about, I think I've talked about the letters, and one of the things that I thought I was so grateful for was that she lived in a period when people wrote letters and kept them. And they also had a sense in which, particularly in the correspondence with Hazzard, you sort of get the sense that they were aware that this was their legacy, and they write very well. I mean, Elizabeth's a wonderful writer. It's very hard for her to write a poor sentence, even in a letter, and they were sort of conscious of their public creation of their public life. I find it quite fascinating because, you know, there's obviously there are people, there still are people who really see their life as I guess in a way they curate a life. She curated her life, Elizabeth, to large degree. So and she was aware of the legacy. She used to say that she didn't want a biography, that's why she tore up the letters, but she deposited most of her material, these massive, quite a large amount of, quite a lot of boxes of papers in the National Library. So anyone who does that, I suppose, is looking for their legacy. And I suppose one of the other wonderful things about the letters that she wrote in that period, people kind of... they used letters in the way that later on people used telephones, and I think in those periods people didn't ring up to have a long conversation on the phone. They wrote a letter because the letter could be delivered to the mountains or, you know, anywhere in the next couple of days. And I think Elizabeth, you see in Elizabeth, she puts a sheet of paper into the typewriter in the morning, does a few, you know, recollections and talking to someone, you know, relating what's happened, and then, you know, goes shopping or goes to get the groceries and comes back and keeps going with the letters. So they were really almost like diaries and, you know, sort of reportings of their day. Later on, she, like everybody else, turned to the telephone more, and then so there are fewer letters. And then later still, she got her an iPad and she would write emails. And in that period when she was being published by text, and when I knew her to some extent, you know, I've got emails from her just, you know, about bits and pieces, because I went a few times to have a cup of tea with her. So she used the iPad and an email much more as she got older. So I just thought I might actually end there, because the title of the book, of course, is Looking for Elizabeth, which begs the question, and of course, slightly dangerous title, is did I ever find her? And also, have I nailed what exactly was the reason why she had that block, that writer's block? And I'm happy to admit that, in a sense, there are many things that contributed to her difficulties in writing, and I think that's more truthful in some senses, because she was quite complex and there were lots of things going on in her life. But one of the things that was really amazing about Elizabeth, I think, is that she was such a serious person. I just want to read, and it's the only thing I'll read from the book, but just a few lines at the end of the book. So here it is. From her earliest, complicated and often unhappy years, Harrower sensed that the real meaning of life was the search for meaning. She'd suffered emotional turmoil, but her struggle was with what lay beneath the here and now. Throughout her life, the big question that excited her, personally and professionally, was not how or what or where, but why. She asked it of herself and she asked it of others. She sat, as she once told her great second cousin and huge friend, Margaret Dick, she sat for a long time trying to understand motive and behaviour. Harrower had always had an acute sense of the reality of the human experience. She saw clearly that, quote, certain sufferings and sorrows are absolutely unavoidable, end quote. Elizabeth Harrower was not averse to the sort of lighter pleasures of eating and drinking. She was a great diner and luncher and other frivolous pastimes. But the pursuits that defined Western societies after World War II, when she was really writing, were never the main game for Harrower. She worked a very different canvas. She looked for happiness, as fleeting as it might be, in understanding people. The little girl from Newcastle, who she always believed that her duty was to pass on the messages that she felt she knew and understood about the world, became a writer who did just that in a very small but perfectly formed bundle of novels and short stories. So.
Many thanks, Helen, who kept to her 20 minutes, and so we've got Geoffrey for 10 minutes. But I should have mentioned early on that it's on the occasion of the launch of Looking for Elizabeth, The Life of Elizabeth Harrower by Helen Trinca, and that was extracted, can you give me that?
Yes.
Extracted last Saturday in the Weekend Australian, which is a very good extract, but the whole thing's better.
Well, maybe not.
Because there's more of it. Now, Geoffrey, have more of Geoffrey now.
So the title of my talk is Why Did Elizabeth Harrower Stop Writing? So I was a friend, but not part of Elizabeth's circle of intimate friends. The cosmopolitan novelist Shelley Hazard, who occasionally visited the Australia of her birth, was one of Elizabeth's intimate friends. Hazard was neat and compact, perhaps glamorous when young. Christina Stead, a truly great novelist, was another of Elizabeth's intimate friends. When I met Stead at Elizabeth's in her old age, I thought she was like a collapsing camellia flower. The fourth of Elizabeth's intimates I observed was Patrick White. White had a craggy Easter Island head like Malcolm Fraser. He shared with Fraser a squattocracy heritage, but where Fraser was obtuse and mediocre and had to get someone else to help him write a book, Patrick White was sharp and appreciative of others, as well as a Nobel Prize-winning novelist. Harrower was tall for a woman born in 1928, probably not so tall now, if she'd been born now, slightly awkward, with an open face and vulnerable. Helen Trinca's biography of Harrower reports these comments Harrower made about her great friend Patrick. He urged me to write, berated me for not writing, hated me for not writing, was mean to me because I wasn't writing, abused me because I wasn't writing, told me I was an artist, not a social worker, when I indeed unwisely spent time helping distressed friends and acquaintances like an unpaid welfare worker. But his way of displaying concern was alienating, lowered my spirits and hurt me. So that was her views of Patrick's criticism of her. That completes the circle of Elizabeth's intimate friends that I was personally able to observe. I had no idea of her friendship with Kylie Tennant until I read Helen's book. My friendship with Harrower began with a book review. I didn't know her at the time, but I was asked by the Bulletin magazine to review her fourth novel, The Watchtower, in 1966. My review was headed Portrait in Black. It began, "One of the dominant themes in the Australian novel at present is the conflict between sensitive and insensitive people, and the way in which the insensitive will attempt to undermine and destroy people who they jealously suspect are different and perhaps superior to themselves. It is a major theme in Patrick White's work, and it is also important in the novels of Elizabeth Harrower. This theme looms much larger in Australian literature at present," that was 1966, "than it does in overseas literature. I suggested that this conflict between the sensitive and insensitive was important in Harrower and White because they came to maturity when anti-intellectualism was still rampant in Australia. I then quoted an illuminating passage from Harrower's very beautiful second novel, I called it very beautiful in my review, second novel, The Long Prospect, published in 1958, where she wrote about Australia, and this is Elizabeth writing in her second novel. "Then and there, in the cities, great wealth masked a naivety one would hesitate to call childlike. To be one of the self-critical minority was to be not so much politically unsound, for there was very little, it seemed, to be political about, as thoroughly disagreeably un-Australian. Two members of the small minority meeting could not easily part without a promise of further meetings, letters, communication. The opportunity was rare." This feeling that she belonged to a self-critical minority is a driving force in much of Harrower's fiction and led to a correspondence of hundreds of letters with Shirley Hazzard. Perhaps because I was 12 years younger than Harrower and male, I did not have her feeling of intense isolation, but I was moved by her fiction. My review of The Watchtower summarised how two daughters, whose father's a doctor, are selfishly taken away by their mother from a good boarding school and set to work when the father dies. The older sister is constrained to marry her boss, Felix, who turns out to be an evil and friendless spiv. My review was lengthy and laudatory about Harrower's psychological insight and prose style, commenting that it's very understatement which gives her writing its power and sincerity. My review contained one qualification. I thought some of Felix's business deals seemed far-fetched and improbable. The ease with which he buys businesses, builds them up, and then sells them at a loss to handsome young men is astounding. If he were as hopeless as all this, it's difficult to see how he is able to build the business up in the first place. That's what I wrote in the Bulletin in 1966. My final paragraph concluded, "The Watchtower is not as perfect as The Long Prospect, because in it Elizabeth Harrower does sometimes move outside her range, but it is a striking and sustained work of great sympathy. It depicts absolute evil and waste, but it also contains within it the seeds of redemption." My vaguely worded seeds of redemption allowed me to end my review with a rhetorical flourish, something loved by schoolboy debaters, which I had once been. A couple of years or so later, I met Elizabeth and she became friends. She perhaps remembered my review as well-intentioned, although rather lacking in finesse. In any event, we never discussed it. She wrote a fond inscription in my review copy of Watchtower. In perhaps the early 1970s, I was invited to a small dinner party Elizabeth held in a Hunters Hill flat where she was then living. Elizabeth's generous purpose was to allow some Australian writers to meet Shirley Hazzard, who was then publishing some remarkable short stories in The New Yorker. Hazzard then wrote a piece in The New Yorker about some of the Australian writers she met at Elizabeth's flat. It is interesting to compare Hazzard and Harrower as writers. Harrower's novels have a ferocious intensity and slowly build up tension with small, painful details. Hazzard is crisp and detached. Hazzard's short stories in People in Glass Houses, 1967, are as sharp as cut glass and hilarious. Her two early short novels, The Evening of the Holiday, 1967, and Bay of Noon, 1970, are lyrically affecting. The Bay of Noon is perhaps Hazlitt's masterpiece, as good as E.M. Forster. But I was disappointed by her widely acknowledged masterpiece, The Transit of Venus, 1980. I found it too artfully composed and staged. Nevertheless, I gave it a long and favourable review. I don't remember where. I was recently surprised to find that Harrower had doubts similar to mine about The Transit of Venus. Susan Wyndham and Brigitte Olibus published a selection of the voluminous letters between Harrower and Hazlitt. Wyndham later wrote, Harrower immediately read The Transit of Venus twice and declared to its author that the novel was, quote, a stunning, dense, complex work, close quote, though she told others she only liked Hazlitt's early novels. These words, stunning, dense, complex, give us the first clue as to why Elizabeth stopped writing. To immediately read her friend's novel twice may indicate Harrower was anxious to like it, but finding it hard to. Now I'll skip the dinner party dinner parties that Manoli, Lascaris and Patrick White attended and I attended, because it's not really very much about Elizabeth Harrower. But Elizabeth was a great fan of Gough Whitlam. She confessed that she had his photograph pinned to the back of her wardrobe. Not long after the infamous dismissal of the Whitlam government in 1975, Elizabeth held a dinner party at a Hunters Hill flat. It may have been when Manoli and I discussed his Castle Hill roses. I recognised these Castle Hill roses and I described it to Manoli and he said, oh, look, I planted them. I had no idea that this had been their house. You see, that's how Manoli and I became friendly. The dinner guests began discussing the dismissal, how terrible it had been. I admired the Whitlam government's legislative reforms, but I was dismayed by its economic record. I ventured the opinion that I had not been sorry to see the Whitlam government go. There was a shocked silence. Patrick White's face froze. Manoli came to my defence because I recognised his roses, I think. Anyway, not long afterwards I got divorced and I lost touch with a lot of my friends, including Elizabeth. A few years later, she invited me to a white-painted Federation House in Stanley Street, Mossman, with sweeping views across Sydney Harbour to the ocean. And that's where I met Christina Stead. So that was my last contact with Elizabeth. To prepare for this talk, I reread Harrower's second novel, The Long Prospect, and that was still as marvellous as when I first read it, about a child who's brought up by a very unsympathetic, harsh grandmother, and she forms various crushes. And then the crush she forms, the last of these on Max, causes trouble, and Max has to leave the house, although it's perfectly innocent. Christina Stead regarded The Long Prospect as Harrower's masterpiece, and I have to agree. Emily's manipulation of the adults around her seeking an escape from her abusive grandmother is wonderfully portrayed. In some ways, it is reminiscent of what Maisie knew, one of Henry James's many masterpieces. Without consciously willing it, Emily brings her parents back together, something that didn't happen with Harrower's own divorced parents. The next novel by Elizabeth I read for the Sydney Institute talk was Down in the City, 1957. That was the first novel. And Esther, an idle socialite in her early 30s, lives in a stone Rose Bay house, and somehow she falls for Stan, a working-class factory owner who drives up to their house in a Cadillac, and she marries him and they go to live in King's Cross, which is rather sort of infra-dig back in that era. And he's a bit of a crook, and he bashed her up once, but then a neighbour in the King's Cross house tells Esther that Stan's having an affair. So, quite surprisingly, Esther invents a whole story as to why this was not an affair, and she sticks up for Stan, and at the end of the book, she more or less resignedly welcomes him home and says, "Hello, Stan." It was a wonderful novel. Lots of parts of it were not so good, but it was wonderfully simple and well done at the end. Then I brought Down in the City, second-hand, many years ago, from Chatswood's White Elephant for 10 cents, but didn't get around to reading it until this year. My copy was owned by the Mickle Book Club of 18 Railway Avenue, Wahroonga, now a Ray White real estate agency. It was lent at 9p per week 57 times over just a few years. How the readers of Wahroonga reacted to this confronting and disturbing book with its remarkable ending is anyone's guess. I then read Harrower's third novel, The Catherine Wheel, a new copy which I ordered on the internet, and it's written in the first person voice of Clemency, a young Australian in England who's studying law. And Clemency somehow agrees to start giving some washed-out actor Christian French lessons, and then the French lessons become a full-blown affair. And Clemency, who's just a remarkable character, just has this incredible knack of being able to put people offside and make them feel bad, and that's how the affair starts as part of the French lessons. Now, Harrower's first three novels deal with complicated and painful emotions, but they have a formal simplicity. Stan wakes Esther, this is Stan the spivvy factory owner, wakes Esther, who's from Rose Bay, from a life of boring conformity. He allows her to have feelings that are shocking and new. She becomes she. That's an actual quote from the book. Emily, that's the long prospect and my favourite of Elizabeth's books, is an innocent manipulator of the adults she depends on and unconsciously engineers an escape from her abusive grandmother and creates for herself a normal life with her parents at the end of her childhood. Christian, this failed actor, wakes impossible longings in Clemency, but she recognises the danger and wisely retreats back to a life with her educated friends. The novelist Joan London told Jason Steger that when she read Harrower's fourth novel, The Watchtower, when she was 18 years old, it gripped her like a nightmare. There is no diminution of emotional intensity in The Watchtower, but it is formally more complex than Harrower's three earlier novels. The accounts I have read of her fifth novel, In Certain Circles, indicates its plotline is yet more complex and episodic than Watchtower. Harrower withdrew In Certain Circles from publication after what had been described as a condescending reader's report, but it seems that Harrower had independently formed a critical review of her fifth novel, similar to her comment about Hazard's The Transit of Venus being stunning, dense, complex. I suspect Harrower's initial criticisms of In Certain Circles may be right, so I haven't read it, and I may be mistaken. Elizabeth's first three novels uniquely combine an exploration of a set of complex and difficult emotions and relationships with formal simplicity. She may have thought she needed to be developed beyond this formal simplicity, but could she? And was it personally worthwhile? Her novels grip like a nightmare. They must have been exhausting to write. Perhaps she just wanted to be happy. The second clue.
So many thanks to Geoffrey as well. Now, as I said, there are copies of Looking for Elizabeth. I'm sure Helen's happy to sign tonight, and we'll be advertising them we'll put them on our website. So if you two come up here, we'll start off questions and discussion. We've got about 20 minutes. Everyone's got to be. You stay here. No, stay here. No,
It's going to disappear.
I'm going to disappear. Yeah.
It's not a very good position.
I thought I was doing the right thing then.
I'm going to disappear by public request.
Right.
Yeah. Now, just
So we go into
no, I'm coming back. I'm going to start off asking you a question, a brief one, so everyone gets the idea. You don't say a lot about her politics, but you mentioned that Harrower had wrote to Judith Wotton, who, as I recall, was a real Stalinist, and Helen, the other one was the biographer of Evatt, Kylie Tennant.
Oh yes, Kylie.
Who was sort of an Evatt lefty. She was pretty left wing, wasn't she?
She was. She was absolutely left wing, a complete lover, as we've noted, of Gough Whitlam. She absolutely adored him. She had became quite left wing in the UK in the 50s, and then when she came to Australia, she was so delighted when Labor sort of got back into power. She followed politics very carefully. She went on to, she sometimes gave out how to vote cards at the various elections, distraught about the dismissal, and she gives some beautiful sort of reporting really of the events, and there's some lovely bits in her letters about the dismissal day and being down in Canberra. Christina Stead takes a phone call, the government's gone, and Elizabeth nearly collapses on the spot, rushes off to Parliament House. So she's very, very clearly on the left, Gerard. I hate to say, perhaps.
You both mentioned the Christina Stead, and I'm wondering why Christina wasn't writing when she came back to Australia, and she didn't write when she was in Australia, and I'm interested to know what effect you thought that she might have had.
Oh, I do. Well, and by that time, really, Elizabeth herself wasn't really writing, so I don't think Christina had an impact on her writing. She was very friendly with her, and I think when Christina came back, she was terribly short of money. She sort of went from between family members, really. She didn't have a house of her own for a long time, and a lot of those people, like Patrick and Elizabeth, kind of looked after her quite a bit. But no, Elizabeth just liked Christina very much. She just thought she was an amazingly strong, courageous woman who'd had quite a lot of difficulties in her later life with ill health. She drank rather too much, I guess, Christina. But Elizabeth just thought she was a great survivor.
Yes. Well, I felt that the Nobel Prize should have been awarded to Christina Stead, frankly, and possibly Patrick White may have thought that too, because she was the first person who got a Patrick White award. But she is a truly great novelist in a way that, Patrick White wrote some reasonable material. The Art Story is a very good novel, but I think he's very imperfect, and Christina Stead wrote some perfect novels.
Congratulations on this contribution to Australian Letters, and I hope your publishers enter it for every biography award that's going. But I'm absolutely intrigued to hear that she struggled with an iPad in her later years when she was about 90 or so. Did that iPad or any of the email trail end up in the National Library? Has all that been lost?
No, the emails aren't in the National Library. I've got some of them, of course, because I exchanged some with her, and she had a lot of exchanges with one of the publishers at Text in that period. They were really her closest friends. And David Winter, who was an editor, I guess, rather than a publisher there, he and she corresponded a great deal. And so, yes, and David gave me access to those. I think there are a lot more emails floating around, I'm sure, because of the nature of emails. But yes, you didn't ask this question, but I guess in a way what you're saying is, are they going to be lost? And in a sense, they are lost, or they're held by individuals. Some of them, of course, I've referred to in the biography.
Where did the money come from?
Aha, the money.
Where did the...
I'm sorry.
Well, I think the question is...
The question is, where did the money come from? Yeah.
Not that she had, massive of money, but she was able to live without working from the age of, mid to late 40s, I suppose. So, yes, what happened in 1970 was her mother died, and Elizabeth by then was born in 1920. I'd always forget how old she was exactly, but anyway, she was in her 40s, and she inherited from her mother. So she inherited the house in Stanley Street in Mossman, which was a very reasonably valuable, but also a big block, a block of flats in New South Head Road, and that block of flats yielded a regular income for her. She did little odd jobs, I think, as well. And then she also had some money, some cash from her mother. When her stepfather died in the following year, she did not inherit it. It appears she did not inherit from him. And then she went on. Look, she had to be careful at various times as time went on. When she sold Mossman eventually, and she bought a smaller flat in Cremorne. Obviously, she had more, cash. But yeah, she was in a way incredibly lucky, because so many women in that period, if they wanted to write, had to marry or did marry, or they couldn't really write full time.
Well, she was one of the first left-wing landlords, was she? Could have joined the Greens.
No. Well, she was one of the very interesting things about her attitudes, of course, is there are letters to Hazard which reveal she loved Geoffrey Blaney's intervention on immigration. And as we know, that was not a left-wing position. And she was quite critical of, around the time of the bicentennial, she was critical of Australians who were making, in her mind, too much of the Indigenous heritage, and she's not unkind or racist. I wouldn't say that at all, but she is very sceptical of some of the claims being made in both of those issues. So those are two ideas or beliefs she had that don't fit easily with the left, I guess.
Thanks. It's great that you're doing this, but Emily Bronte wrote one book, and we're still talking about it. So what is it about Elizabeth Harrower that she wrote 5 books, and we're saying, why didn't she write more? Now, is it because the books haven't resonated? Geoffrey indicates that there's plenty in there for us to take seriously. Or is it because we're not able to say that she just didn't have anything more to say, and be honest about it, and she wasn't like Geoffrey, hungry to write? Could you both answer that?
Yes, Geoffrey, do you have a thought about that first?
Well, Patrick White told her apparently 4 plots that she should turn into novels. Probably some of them would have been about her relationship with Kylie Tanner, which would have been painful for her to write about. But I think that her 3rd novel is the Catherine Wheel is the clue as to what Patrick White should have told her, because it's written in the first person and it's more approachable than any of the other novels. And if she'd written in the first person, which was not difficult for her because she wrote hundreds of letters in the first person, then she may have gone on writing. But somehow, for some reason, it didn't occur to her to write more novels in the first person, because I think she would have gone on writing if that had occurred to her. But she somehow thought, I've got to write these formal novels, these complicated novels in the third person, and I'm not really up to it. It's all too painful.
Well, that's right, because I think her novels are incredibly autobiographical, and she would have resisted the idea of them being seen as autobiographical. But can I just say, David Malouf, I'm going to quote David Malouf because I talked to him about this and he's in the book. What he said was, a writer, people who write books think that they've got to keep on writing, that you've had some success, and he believes you don't. And to your point, really, which is that he believed that Elizabeth had written everything she needed to write. In fact, in the first 4 books, I don't think David necessarily thought the publication of In Certain Circles was needed. He felt there was a beautiful corpus of work in her 4 books, and that was that. And we hesitate to use the word therapy, and she would never have used that word, and I don't either. But I think she'd written her life story in many ways, and she'd worked through, again, inverted commas, quite a lot of complexity of her own psychology by the writing of those first books. And I suppose I hadn't really thought about that. I actually don't like the Catherine Wheel very much. You might think it's the most accessible. I think it's one of the one of the harder ones to get a grip on. But yes, she resisted the idea all the time when she was younger that these books were about her.
Thank you both. Just a question about the London years, perhaps the money issue, and also were there any influences there? For example, you know, there were people like George Johnson and some painters and so forth. There's some Australians in London, or other influences there.
She had a very isolated life in London. She was not a typical expat at all, and she knew very few no Australians. She didn't want to know Australians, and she didn't have a literary circle. It was extraordinary, really. She sat in her sort of cold water flats for several years. She had a great friendship with Margaret Dick, her second cousin, who was Scottish. She was living in Scotland and they shared flats. But I think it was, she wrote in a bubble in a way, and perhaps that was really the joy or the why they are so successful. I think when she emerged in Sydney and she had a wider circle, all these distractions, all these difficulties, all these expectations, it was harder. The question of money in London was interesting. She lived very sparingly and she did typing jobs because she always said one of the best things that she ever had learnt was to touch type, because her stepfather sent her off to business college, I think effectively as a teenager. She didn't go to university, and she was a great touch typist, which was a very valuable thing when she was writing draft after draft.
Yeah, thank you. So during the writer's block period, she write, other than the letters and that fifth note, did she write outlines or drafts or just nothing?
Look, in the 1970s, when she was struggling, she obviously did. She references in her letters, I've got to go back. You know, she says to Shirley Hazzard, I've got to go. I've got to try to keep writing. I've got to get the discipline of writing. And she wrote bits and pieces, and there are fragments here and there, but really most of that I think has disappeared. She wrote some short stories. Her last short story was 1977, I think, published then. But yeah, she didn't write, unlike Hazzard, who was writing non-fiction sort of essays and political issues. Elizabeth didn't do that. She really, her world was a fictionalised world.
She wrote so brilliantly in the 50s about young women struggling in patriarchal families. Did she see herself as a feminist?
She definitely did not see herself as a feminist, and she resisted that label a lot in her later life. I've often thought, in a way, I don't think any woman writer really wants to necessarily be called a feminist writer, or certainly in that period they would like to be known as a writer rather than a feminist writer. It was a word that really in the 50s even wasn't really sort of used as much, but she didn't see herself as that, but she definitely is a writer about the power struggles, I suppose, the power differentials between men and women. I'd use the word coercive control, which was a phrase not even invented then, but she's writing about coercive control, particularly as Jeff has noticed, in the Watchtower. You know, Felix is a very oppressive, it's sort of psychological domestic violence, really, I guess, in many ways, over these two women. Do you think she's a feminist?
No, I wouldn't say that. I certainly didn't have the feeling that Elizabeth was a feminist. No.
Just on the topic of that, you make the point in your book, I've read the extract in the Weekend Australian, that how Patrick White might have been effectively a bully and counterproductive in relation to what he did with respect to her.
Do you want is it a question or sorry? Oh yeah, absolutely. Look, I think he was complex, and the relationship was complex, but ultimately she valued it highly. She was very excited and pleased that he had scooped her up and cared enough about her to keep asking her to write. But he was also, she says in this memoir that is in her papers and hasn't been published and probably will never be published in full, but she's really writing about the fact that he could be very difficult towards her. She says something really interesting too. She says that Patrick hated hated it when Elizabeth, got publicity or got noted when she was asked to do things or when people praised her, which is a really interesting, if it's true, and one assumes that it's what happened. It's the fact that he was almost jealous of Elizabeth's getting larger fame is an interesting commentary that someone else might be able to unpack about Patrick White at some stage.
Yes, she had a genuineness of emotion which I feel is lacking in Patrick White's work, with the exception of The Aunt Story, which I think is a marvellous book. But she had real feeling. He had a wonderful prose style when he turned it on. She wrote simply most of the time without a lot of frills. So in many ways, she had an intensity that he was lacking.
Thank you. Geoffrey, you mentioned one of the books is about a woman giving French lessons in London and then an affair. Now, is that autobiographical as well? Did she have an affair, and was that the only ever relationship she had with a man?
I think that Christian must have been based on somebody that she knew. It's a painful book, but because it's written in the first person, you know that she's going to come out of it at the end. With the other books that are written in the third person, you don't actually know whether they're going to come out of it at the other end. And that's why I think that the first person might have been a good voice for her, because it gives the reader some hope. In The Watchtower, you're not given very much hope at all. Of course, it does have an optimistic or a semi-optimistic ending, but you're left in suspense. But the Christian, in that it's a wonderful portrait of somebody who manipulates other people's emotions. It's a brilliant but horrible character sketch, but it really is quite extraordinary, I think.
Just on that point of whether that was her affair, if only we had some of those letters that she wrote to her mother in that period back in Australia that she tore up in her old age, because I think that would have revealed what affair, if any, would have happened in the 50s. It's hard to believe that she could write with such insight, really, about that manipulation. Hard to believe that she didn't have some personal experience, but at the same time, she was an enormously good observer of other people's lives and from childhood, really, and she knew all about manipulation, I think, from her own relationship with her grandmother and those early years as well. So yeah, if only maybe someone will pop up somewhere and let us know more about the London years, because they were the most difficult years as a biographer to look at, because the contemporaries aren't there, and the letters that she would have wrote back aren't available.
This is just a thought, but maybe the novel she never wrote, that would have been the big one, was about her and Patrick White.
Well, that's
and I think, and do you think that the reason that never occurred to her was because she was too much of two minds about him?
Yes.
And she couldn't see it as the tragedy that it really was.
Yeah, and I think she was also at one level, incredibly in his thrall. You know, I don't think she would have been. She was able, after he died, the memoir where all of this is revealed, those typed pages come several months or a year or so after Patrick died, and after the release of the David Marr biography of Patrick, and she takes a little bit of umbrage at the depiction of herself in the David Marr biography, and so she's at some level she's setting it straight, and then she obviously her sense of the relationship and the difficulties of the relationship were quite strong there. 30 years later, when she's talking to the press and all of us about Patrick White, it's completely laudatory, and there's much less about that.
This is the 35-page memo you
33,
found.
yeah,
33
yeah.
pages you found that she'd typed. Yeah, Geoffrey, a final comment on?
So,
Do you want to make a final comment?
well, simply that Elizabeth's first three novels, I think, have a formal simplicity. The Watchtower is becoming more complex, and she failed to find that voice which would have allowed her to continue without suffering.
I think people should try to read in certain circles, which I actually really like. That's the fifth novel, the one that she didn't like. It's much more sort of more modern in tone, and actually I think it's fairly accessible. And yes, it's uneven, but you can see it's very good. All 5 books are really terrifically worthwhile reading.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
So it's good to have a discussion on Elizabeth Harrower. She came to a couple of our functions, one at our terrace at 41 Phillip Street, one at our annual dinner, and she was always welcome here. And it's great to have her discuss here today with best wishes to Helen Trinca and her book, her biography. That's the first biography, I think. And to Geoffrey Lehmann for his personal knowledge. So well done, and we'll have you back again sometime in the future, but well done today. Thank you.